2009, my dad got us this PlayStation 3, my very first gaming console. If I'm correct, in 2013, got my very first handheld console, the PSP. And now in 2024, got my very first Windows gaming PC. So that is close to 15 years of console gaming. And now I finally got to try PC gaming properly for the first time. I have owned more consoles than these. I have a PS2, a PS3 Super Slim, and an Xbox One. So the reason I say properly is because I have PC gamed here and there on like Intel HD graphics. And ask anyone who's played on Intel HD graphics, you're getting like 10 frames per second, which is horrible. So yeah, I have played Minecraft, Need for Speed, that kind of stuff. But with this thing, I can play everything from this emulated Ridge Racer over here all the way up to GTA 4. In fact, for the first time in my life, I actually beat GTA 4 thanks to this handheld right here. So this video will be a mix between a review of the ROG Ally and my first experience in PC gaming properly. The first thing you notice about this hardware is how much bigger it is in real life. Here's a PSP. It's about the same size as like a 2015 Android phone, 4.5-inch screen, very small, and you can fit this in a pocket. For example, here's my gown pocket. Meanwhile, with this thing, it's really big. It's essentially like an iPad, but with a tiny screen. Only my gown pocket can hold this thing. Barely. But every other pocket, it's way too big for, which is a shame. And as you can see, it's also really wide. Takes a minute to get used to, especially if you're like me and you play on like normal console controllers. Apparently this is one of the lighter Windows handhelds out there, weighing just over 600 grams. And you definitely feel it because sure, compared to an iPad, it's kind of heavy, but considering the amount of power that's packed in here, it is surprisingly light. Now, I was lucky to have only spent around $400 on this setup myself. If I had spent the full $800, I'm not sure I'd be happy because the buttons on here, they wiggle quite a bit, and hopefully you can see that, especially compared to an Xbox One controller. The analog sticks have a lot of wobble to them as well before you can register input. Thankfully, it doesn't really impact the gameplay. It's also got these buttons at the back, which I wish more console controllers came with because you can map them to anything. For example, you can take a screenshot by pressing A. You can open up a project window, notifications you can project, and you can map it to other stuff. I also forgot it comes with RGB. I personally don't like RGB. It's there if you want it. You can change between different settings like breathing, strobing, color cycle, all that kind of stuff. But I basically leave it all. Now let's talk about my experience with gaming on this device. Thanks to this ROG Ally right over here, I've played more games in the past 2-3 months than I ever have in like since 2020 started. Basically, I've beat Armored Core, beat GTA 4, I've beat Ridge Racer over here. In fact, I'm getting close to a 100% completion, 96%. And here's the game itself, actually. I got this also with the PS3 back in 2009. This thing is so convenient. I actually keep it in a drawer in my bedroom. Anytime I'm bored, pull this thing out, turn it on, I do a few races, then I turn it off, I go back to living life. And that makes gaming so convenient. Because normally, with a console, you have to make sure the TV, the living room is clean. I mean, there's no one there. And you turn on the console, which takes a few minutes. Boot up the game, which takes some more minutes. And then eventually you're in and you can play. But for example, you can't actually go on the console at 3 a.m. because your parents are going to be like going to be suspicious about what you're doing. But with this thing, literally anytime you're awake, you can play this thing. It's perfect. One thing I'm not a fan of is the battery life. I actually had to get a charger because it went down to 30% from 60%. Just from me filming this part of the video. So yeah, you're gonna need the power bank or wait for the new ROG Ally X because that one comes with a battery that's double the size. But yeah, battery life on these things is horrible. Now the best part about switching from console to PC has to be Steam. Because I know back in the day, I used to go online, people would say, oh, I bought 300 games, but I don't have time to play them. I was just like, where do you get the money? 300 games. Turns out Steam is incredibly cheap when it comes to games. For example, here's this game called Just Cause 3. Back in 2016, I watched this guy called Jacksepticeye play this game. I was like, wow, it's so fun. But now in 2024, I bought this game for less than the price of a McDonald's Happy Meal. It's crazy. I played so much of this game. And here's some things on my wish list. Don't judge. Here's Saints Row 2 for 40 Rand, which is once again like $2. This game was actually on sale. This collection was on sale for $6 a few weeks ago. Same with this one actually. $6. It was also about $3. Like For those prices, it's so difficult to say no. So no wonder people just buy so many games on here. And if you don't fancy paying for your games, you still do have a bunch of free-to-play ones like War Thunder, Warzone, Fortnite, all these other games. So value-wise, you get the best prices. Variety-wise, there's a massive amount of games that you'll never ever see on console. Now, one thing I don't like about the ROG Ally specifically is Windows 11, because sure, on a computer, Windows 11 works fine, I have no complaints, but on a tiny screen like this, with no keyboard or mouse, it's actually a headache to navigate. For example, here we have a right analog stick being used as a mouse, but if you have to do tiny adjustments, like for example, here's me trying to minimize RTSS. Look at this, I have to basically scoot the mouse over, and even then, I barely get it on, almost. You can see how much I'm struggling just to get to that minimize icon. Yes. See, things like that where it's like a huge headache to use Windows. Or the fact that to update the ROG Ally, you first have to go to my Asus, like this, my Asus, to update stuff. Then you have to go to Armory Crate to update stuff again. Then you still have Windows updates to do as well. You have to come over to settings. Let's see, updates. You have to go to 3 different places just to do updates, which is just too much. Compared to some consoles where you just go to one place to update the firmware and then another place to update the games. But here, you have to go to so many different places, which is annoying. Now, since the Ally doesn't have a physical keyboard, you can open this virtual keyboard over here to type all your stuff. You can also switch to a more advanced version, like traditional. But the downside is, it's so much slower to execute keyboard shortcuts with this virtual keyboard. And so in most cases, I will always be less productive working on the touchscreen itself. And I basically have to find a keyboard and a mouse to plug in to make work go much faster, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a handheld device if you have to plug it in just to do some work. The next thing that I feel like most console players will not appreciate is just how much time you have to spend tinkering with settings. For example, in Armory Crate, if I open it up, I have to mess around with operating modes. You can see how I have to mess around with how much power I need for each game to preserve battery life. I had to mess around with the fan curves, as you can see. And then on top of that, each game has its own set of graphical settings that you need to tinker with to make sure you get a good experience. So for me, no joke, it took like 2 days just to get everything set up initially. No games were played in the first 2 days of owning this thing. And I'm sure that's why in Best Buy in the US, a lot of people ended up returning their ROG Allies because they just were not ready for just how much PC stuff they had to mess with. Whereas with the console, if I wanted to play GTA 4 on my PS3, I pretty much launched my PS3, put the GTA 4 disc in, and I'm good to go. That's like 5 minutes at max. Meanwhile, this thing was like 30 minutes getting everything set up. But the upside is that now you get to mess around with a lot more things than you would on a console. For example, if I wanted to, I could turn up the graphics and lock this game at 30 FPS. But instead, I leave everything at lowest settings and I can run at about close to 60 FPS, which in my opinion is worth the trade-off. In my opinion, FPS is always better than better graphics. But there's also a cool trick you can do. You can see how the game is at 50 FPS. We can launch this thing called lossless scaling. Okay, I switched to a different game because GTA doesn't play nice. So here we go. So this is a PSP game. The normal FPS of this game is 20, which is horrible. It literally looks like a slideshow. Let me see if I can give you an example. You can literally see each individual frame. So bad. But because this is an emulator, just open up here. Hit a cheat, 60 FPS. Go back, and now 60 FPS. But no, this isn't the highest that we can go. Now, because of this app which I said was lossless scaling, this one uses AI to almost double your frame rate. So we can use it here, for example. You open up the game and give it a few seconds. And now we've got a PSP game running at 120 FPS. I hope you can see the smoothness because, wow, it looks so good. Now, of course, compared to real FPS, there will be more input lag, but it's so smooth. This is one of those things that you can't do on the console. As far as I'm aware, there is only one game out there on the console that uses this kind of technology. So here it is, a PSP game running at 6 times more FPS than was originally intended, and it's so good. By the way, this game has one of the biggest video game maps ever. It's basically a whole Hawaiian island that you can drive around. It can take like half an hour to an hour to drive there at over 200 kilometers per hour. So yeah, it's the real deal. Oh yeah, and speaking of emulation, because of emulation, we can run this at a higher quality than intended. For example, the PSP originally ran at about 240, which as you can see is super blocky. But the power of emulation, you can change this to 4K or even 4K if you want, and now everything is so much smoother. It's so cool. It's crazy to think that back in the 2000s, this was the most powerful thing you could get at the size. But now you can run over here 4 times the resolution, double the FPS, all that, with almost the same battery life. This one could get about 4 to 5 hours. With these settings, maybe you'll get 2 hours, which is bad. The PSP still kind of wins from a battery life perspective. If you can also run other consoles. Now here's another childhood classic of mine, MX vs ATV. Untamed. You can also run this on my M1 MacBook Air, get about similar performance, because this game isn't really that stressful. So here we are. I can't actually drive with one hand, so here's a showcase. No stress. Only pulling about 10 watts. If you showed me this in 09 or 2010, I would just go crazy. But here it is, running very well. But then we also have PlayStation 3, like I showed earlier. So we have a couple of favorites. Instead, I'm going to show you Wipeout HD Fury. This game originally ran at 60 FPS, but check it out. Now we're running at 120 FPS. It's more like one of the issues I deal with PC is that games crash a lot more often. For example, on an Xbox One, it was rare for me to have crashes every single day. But with this thing, first time I got F124, it would always keep crashing. The whole first 2-3 weeks of having this game, I basically couldn't play it because it would never stay up long enough for me to finish a race. And even if I did finish a race, the game would crash just as I finished, which is annoying. So that's one of the downsides of PC gaming, is that sometimes games don't run as good as they should. But it's EA, so what do you expect? The ROG Ally only has a GPU, which is the equivalent of a GTX 1650. If you are okay with running everything on low at 720p or 900p, then you'll be pretty happy with the performance here. Battery life on this thing, it has a 40 watt hour battery somewhere underneath here. Same size as my MacBook Air M1. So while the M1 can do 10 hours just sitting around, this Ally will do 4 hours at best. I think it's because Asus decided to limit the minimum power to about 7 watts, which is not low enough, in my opinion. Then when you're gaming, depending on the intensity of the game, might need anywhere from 12 watts to 20 to 25. So with less intensive games like emulators, you can afford to run it at like 7 to 10 watts like PSP games. In that case, you can get close to 4 hours. Thankfully, with the ROG Ally X, they are addressing the battery issue. Now this 90 minutes should be around 3 hours instead, which is much more acceptable. Yeah, so while I can't run everything at medium to high graphics, I am overall quite happy with the performance of the Ally. Now let's talk about the one thing that I'm not too happy with, besides the battery, which is the storage. As you can see, we only have about 60 gigabytes free. That's with 3 like large console size games. So I do find myself having to delete games often if I want to download new ones, especially if they're like AAA titles. So if you can, find budget for a 1 terabyte upgrade, because that's necessary. And you can see I'm not using the SD card because the Ally is known for an SD card failure. So there's no point in using that anyways. So yeah, overall I like this. I like PC gaming, and honestly I think it was one of the best choices I made in 2024. Switch to PC guys, it's best.